My name is Arthur Lavin. I'm a pediatrician in a two-person group called Advanced Pediatrics, and we're independently owned and very much involved in helping families whose children have special needs in education, psychologically, behavioral, what have you. And what I tried to do tonight is in 5 minutes discuss what social cognition is, the definition of autism spectrum disorder, and answer the question whether autism spectrum disorder is on the rise. So here we go. Now, I mentioned as a background piece social cognition because the heart of autism and autism spectrum disorders is an abnormality in social cognition. When I think about social cognition, I think about 4 areas of development: gross motor, fine motor, language and speech, and social. And of those 4 overall domains in which children develop, social cognition is by far the least understood and the most complex. Language is plenty complex, and we don't know a whole lot about each of these things. But there are fairly well-established techniques that are very successful to help people advance in gross motor, fine motor, and speech and language skills. Social therapies are in their infancy. There are things to do, but they're not nearly as well developed as the other 4 modalities. And so autism is really in the domain of social cognition. There are many features of autism spectrum disorder. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the DSM is the reference that we use to define these things. All mental health disorders are in this book in the United States. And autism spectrum disorder is a new diagnosis with this edition, which came out in 2014. The term autism was actually coined as diagnosed in 1910. And believe it or not, it was Victor Asperger who applied it to what we now know as autism in 1938. This diagnosis in DSM-5 came out in 2015. I won't go over in detail all the elements of the definition, but there are 5 elements I can very quickly mention. One is a persistent deficit in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. So that's what we're talking about. Social cognition is impaired to some degree. Severity needs to be documented. Second domain is restricted repetitive patterns of behavior or interests or activities. So it doesn't have to be abnormal behavior, it could be abnormal patterns of interest or activities, as manifested by at least 2 of a list of 4 examples. And then the third domain is symptoms have to start in early childhood. You don't develop autism when you're 30. Fourth is symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, and other important areas of current functioning, meaning all of us may feel a little socially impaired at times, but it doesn't rise to the level of autism spectrum disorder unless it's impairing. Notice that all definitions of the DSM-5 are highly subjective. Nowhere in the book does impairment get spelled out exactly. So communities have to agree on what an impairment is in order for that to qualify as an impairment. And the fifth and final thing I'll just mention on the definition is the symptoms cannot be better explained by other diagnoses. So you might have symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, as I've listed, but they might be better explained by what used to be called mental retardation, which is now intellectual disability or global developmental delay. The Asperger's syndrome, basic developmental delay not otherwise specified, are now, and autism itself, are now all bundled into what is now called autism spectrum disorder. So Asperger's did not go away, it just got subsumed under. So all forms of autism are now in this one rubric of autism spectrum disorder. And the last thing I'll touch on very briefly before opening up the rest of the panel is this question we get asked a lot, which is whether autism spectrum disorder is actually on the rise or not. So how many people here think that there's more, greater percentage of children with autism spectrum disorder now than 20 years ago? Okay, so we'll see if I can change those answers shortly. So from my perspective, it seems that anecdotally, it's definitely on the rise. We see a lot more people than 20 years ago. But there's a lot of controversy about whether it's actually more common or whether we're diagnosing it more frequently. So Dr. Urban Hertz-Picciotto, and I put her name in the handout, I think. Yes, she is the world's leading epidemiologist on autism. She is not an expert on autism, she's an expert in epidemiology, and she's devoted her career to these sorts of questions. She did a 12-year study across the whole state of California. She looked at just people who had very severe forms of autism on the spectrum, so there'd be no question about whether they had autism over a 12-year period. And what she found was over a 12-year period in the state of California, the incidence of autism went up 7-fold. But being the careful epidemiologist that she was, she looked to see whether the rate of diagnosis was impacted by people starting to diagnose kids at a younger age, whether a definition changed, which it did in 1994. Remember, Asperger's syndrome was born then as a diagnosis. Before that time, people were diagnosed as having autism of any form. And PDD came into line as well. So a lot more people got the diagnosis because it's easier to qualify for diagnosis around that time. So change in definition, earlier testing, and then the third thing that would increase the incidence without actually changing how common it is this whole structure of the IDEA, or the Special Services in School regimens that really incentivize people to seek categories in order to receive services.